But with this, I'd like to introduce and turn over the stage to Dave Wetzel, the COO of MLS Listings.
Thanks, Chris. I think I've learned something about who not to drink with the night before moderating a session.
I could have sold you that little piece of advice.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you. So we have a session right now that's on security and compliance, and the compliance section for this is really about how do we comply with the changing laws that we have. I was talking to Danae about this session a while ago, and coming up with some ideas, and it was the week that the CEO of Facebook was up in front of Congress. And I was on another panel that same week, and the panel had nothing to do with security or compliance, but all the questions that the panel got that week was around the privacy of the data that was in the MLS. And it was quite interesting. And then in the hallway, after the panel discussion, I had a number of people come up and talk to me, and there was a vendor that was there with me as well. And one of the vendors was asked about privacy, and the vendor's response was, well, we buy the data from the MLS, and we buy data from other sources, so it's our data. And we're not held to any of the laws around privacy or security because it became our data when we purchased it, which isn't exactly the case. And so we thought, oh, this might be an interesting topic to talk about. And so with me, I have three great panelists, and I'm going to pause here and let them introduce themselves.
Sure.
Amy?
Thanks, Dave. I'm Amy Gorse, Principal of Business Development with CoreLogic. Came about a year ago through the acquisition of Clarity that's been heavily focused on security and real estate for 15 plus years.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Yes, thanks, Dave. I'm Stephen Skinner. I'm the Chief Information Officer of First Team Real Estate in Orange County, and I have had the fortune to work at two of the largest private brokerages in California.
And I'm Jonathan Spinetto, one of the co-founders and Chief Operating Officer at Remind, and I've been a licensed agent since I was 18 years old.
Great. So we have MLS, vendors, and brokerages involved here on this discussion. So I'd like to start off with kind of looking at where some of the security concerns have been, and we've seen a number of problems with email. And so there's a whole new category of problems called a business email compromise. And Stephen, why don't you tell us a little bit about that and your experience in the brokerage?
Sure, happy to do it. So it turns out that information security is the thing that we get paid to worry about at night. I didn't know that when I took the job, but and I do have several new acronyms that I will share with you. So BEC, Business Email Compromise, being one of them. It's a big word for something that we're all very familiar with, which is that because of our reliance on email, it is the open door through which many bad actors can enter our data ecosystem. Because First Team operates escrow and title organizations as well, for us, the dark side of BEC has been fraudulent wire transfer instructions sent to one or more parties in a transaction. And we have had to understand that process, how it can happen, educate our staff and our agents when it does happen, and also to develop a response plan. And we've also had to get to know our local FBI agents. And they've been great. And the other acronym that I will share with you, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, is IC3. That's the Internet Crime Complaint Center, ic3.gov. You're going to want to learn about that at some point.
Okay, okay. So Amy, has CoreLogic had any experiences with this business email compromising?
Not so much with the compromise, although we facilitate 60 million emails plus per day, in the MLS space. But certainly just from the point of view of people like you getting those calls saying, hey, I think I was, compromised. How did they get my email address? We deal with those kind of questions all the time. And I think just to Stephen's point about education, something that we've tried to do through Matt Cohen, who I know is in the audience at Clarity, is just get out ahead of some of these things and really hold these business email compromise seminars to help educate the MLSs who can help educate their brokerage community about just simple things that they can do, to be more diligent, including just communicating to the consumers how they're going to communicate with them when it comes to a set of wire instructions. I think that's critically important. I'm amazed at how many brokerages don't have a basic policy that says this is how we will communicate with you when we're asking for wire instructions. So I think there's just some simple things we've put together in a 30-minute webinar that we'll do for MLSs or for brokers that really helped kind of create an awareness, and that's really just key. The consumers are very trusty overall, and so they're really putting our trust in all of us, and we've got to just do a little better.
Okay. So one of the things that we've seen recently, and this came up in some of the Facebook things in front of Congress, is some of the laws that are changing. We've seen some of the laws that are in Europe. There's the GDPR laws that came up in May recently, and they're pretty stringent and around privacy and the data. And we're starting to see that there'll be changes coming in the US as well. So I'm in California, so our office is in Sunnyvale, California. California is looking at changing laws now around security and privacy. They have a number of laws. They're not quite settled yet, but they've said that they will be in place by 2020. How do you see preparing for some of these changes?
Sure. Well, the thing I've learned in the last 12 months is that when you work for a publicly traded company, they prepare well in advance for things that have to do with compliance, particularly as it relates specifically to government law. And so I think, as we begin to think about how to prepare, I went to look inside our own organization about how we just deal with the 50-plus privacy laws that are on the books today in North America, and how we deal with that as an organization. And there's a couple of things we do. One is that we've established a data governance group within CoreLogic. So there's an entire team of people dedicated to data governance, everything from where we got it, to where it's stored, to where it's allowed to go, to who it's allowed to go to, so that we have our arms around every piece of data that exists and what can be done with it. We're fortunate, because we are in a large publicly traded company, fortunate to have a large compliance team that stays ahead of, the potential legislation that could be impacting us, and is working with our compliance team at all times to establish what sort of policies we're going to need down to the state and local municipality level in some cases to deal with those. And so I'd say as an industry, as we're starting to prepare for something like this, the first step is just understanding everything we all have inside our own shops, what we have, where we're getting it, where we're allowed to put it or not, is a good first step, I think, in really just beginning to establish being prepared. If somebody says, okay, there's been an incident, you have an incident response plan, but the first step is to even understand every piece of data that you have, and again, where you're storing it and where it's allowed to go, so that you know if that's been compromised.
So I imagine in the CoreLogic system, you have a lot of MLS data. We have a lot of MLS data. Jonathan, you have a lot of privacy type of information just to run the Remind business. Can you talk a little bit about the privacy information you hold, and do you have a governance type thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, when you look at a lot of what data elements come in, it's about understanding where those data pieces come from. So, whether you're any size vendor in this industry, you're going to have access to several pieces of key data, whether that's MLS or other data elements that were curated by your users on your platform. And that's going to be a combination of both first-party and third-party data, right? So either data that you originate yourself or data that you're purchasing and acquiring through other parties. So you need to know where all of this data came from, so that in the event of new legislation that might be enacted, or if you are wanting to be able to utilize that data for resources and applications inside your system, you have to have an understanding of the source of that data so you can be proper and be ahead of the curve. One of the biggest takeaways about what's going on right now in the legislative industry is that the legislators across the federal and state level are trying to find where's the right spot of regulating what is done or not done with information out there, whether it is private or public information. They're trying to find that balance. We're seeing that through the California legislation, which was passed, but at the same time was not finalized. I think in the next couple years we'll see variations of some of the European standards, but at the end of the day, back to Dave's point, you have to have a team that is aware. So whether you're large or whether you're small, whether you're medium-sized, whether you're a brokerage, an association, or an MLS, awareness is the biggest takeaway from hearing about all this regulations is be aware of where your data is coming from, be aware of where your data is being used so that when these new laws come into place, you have the ability to take action on it and be able to be cognizant of how that could affect you potentially.
And Stephen, you probably have a different set of data, as a brokerage.
Yes, we have a lot of we have a lot of consumer information. We have publicly identifiable information, PII for those of you who are keeping score. And it turns out that compliance and data governance, it's really a necessary evil. Evil because it's a lot of work, necessary because it's really important. Mm-hmm. And with the consumerization of IT, which affects all companies now, any department in any enterprise can really run their own IT shop just out of the App Store. And if you're the CIO or you're in charge of infrastructure, it makes it hard to know what different people are doing within your own organization. Then try to find out who is storing personally identifiable information that may need to be secured. And across the transaction, escrow, title, real estate agents, we handle social security numbers, credit cards, bank records. There's almost no end to the various types of personally identifiable information that might be inside of a broker's ecosystem, but it's difficult to find out where it all is and then to determine who needs to have access to it. And for compliance, you have to attest, in fact, that you have these controls. And if it's a lot of work in the US, it's even stricter if you're dealing with international rules like those in Europe. And I think the takeaway from what's going on in Europe is just they're ahead of us in terms of trying to protect consumers' privacy rights. Mm-hmm. And that will, at some point, trickle down to what we're doing here.
Okay. So when you look at the consumers' rights, one of the things we've heard about in the European laws is they have rights to change the data or to remove the data. So have any of you had calls in from people who thought that they might have had those rights with the data that you hold?
Oh yeah, I mean, we get people that will call in and ask for their information to be removed all the time, and we have a form that they can fill out requesting for what pieces of information to be removed from the system. But also, too, that form is designed to educate, because if the local government jurisdiction supplies your name as the legal owner of a property, I cannot remove that record from that particular database, right? Right. I can only remove certain pieces of information that I have inside that is back to the not necessarily public piece of information. So we are happy to remove it, and I think that any organization needs to be prepared for that in that sense of a customer reaching out to them in an MLS association vendor in that case, for sure.
And I think part of your data governance process has to be, it is part of ours, what information can be edited, changed, or removed. And to Jonathan's point, what's just a matter of fact, right? That cannot be removed. The fact that you own this home is a matter of public record. So there, there's limits on, I think, what data can be modified as well. And so having, kind of consumer education pieces is something we're not typically doing, right? We have a B2B relationship with you, Dave, at MLS Listings. And so it'll be interesting to see the impact of something similar to a GDPR or something like that in the U.S., because we will, just like we had to do CAN spam and other consumer-facing legislation, end up having to come up with a mutually agreeable solution between our organizations on how to handle something like that.
And Stephen, have you had people that have called to say, I'd like to change?
We have two interesting examples. One with MLS listings. When I was at Alon Pinnell, we would occasionally have high net worth individuals who had purchased significant properties who would ask for the sold photos to be removed from display because they were concerned about invasion of privacy by public display of sold photos on an MLS or on a broker website. We also occasionally have people who want to protect their privacy by having their property removed from Zillow. And that's a very different conversation, which doesn't always go real well. But an interesting point of historical fact, these GDPR, the European regulations, are really an outgrowth of some of the authoritarian governments in Europe, particularly in Germany and East Germany, which were meticulous about keeping records on everyone. And so, as a whole, Europe has said, we don't want governments having that kind of control over our privacy. And 50, 75 years after World War II, in a way, we're still kind of dealing with repercussions from that.
So we at MLS Listings have had a few times where people call and make some requests that kind of surprised us. We've had some agents who did go through the compromised email and believed that their email passwords were compromised because they used some passwords that you could social engineer. So for example, Chris was talking about my Halloween costume last year as a Elvis, and if I had that in an agent profile, so all of our agents have a paragraph or two as a profile so that we can put on the consumer-facing website and consumers can try to find an agent that they're going to resonate with. And maybe it's my Elvis thing that I mentioned there. Maybe it's my fact that I have 2 daughters or I mountain bike. And some of those could be things that I've accidentally used as passwords. Yep. So we've had agents call and say, I want all of that removed from MLS Listings. And then they've gone another step further and said, well, actually, I'd like to have my name, my license, my email, my phone number removed from all of the listings that I have as active. And then we've had to sit down with them and try to explain to them, well, how are people going to contact you if you're trying to sell this property and there's no contact information there? And oh, by the way, there's a California state law that says that it has to be there. So there's some lines there. Then we usually will go over those with the agents who call in and get to a point where, as Jonathan mentioned, we can change what we can change, and there are things that we can't change.
You know, just to follow up on that, there was an exploit or an attack that made the rounds within the last few months where if you were a victim, you received an email which was an extortion attempt that said, I know what you're doing on your computer and I'm going to tell everybody because it's not good and you have to pay me in Bitcoin. And just to prove that I know what I'm doing, here's your password. Well, after the security industry really unraveled what was going on here, the passwords that were being sent out in this extortion attempt to prove to people that their computers had been hacked, these were passwords that had been exploited and released years earlier by one of these large-scale data breaches of a credit organization or something like that. That's small comfort if you think that someone has gained access to your computer, but what it speaks to is the scale of this fraudulent internet crime industry. It is on a scale similar to Silicon Valley, and in fact, law enforcement calls it Crimicon Valley, and it is a multi-billion-dollar annual organized crime enterprise run out of countries where there are very few controls over this. And just like software development and technology is modular, you can be a player in this industry if you hack passwords. And you can sell those passwords to someone who wants to do phishing attempts. And if you know how to design the pages so it looks like the login to someone's bank, all these subcontractors come together and they sell their wares on a thriving dark web marketplace that is behind all of this. On a scale that's really, quite alarming if you realize that if you're the victim of an extortion attempt online and you're asked to pay in Bitcoin, there may even be a support number you can call to tell you how to do that.
Right.
So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's now say the action has happened. Someone has broken into our data warehouses and exposed that sensitive information. We talked about having a plan, a response plan. Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about what Remind has in that if that unfortunate incident were to happen? How do you put together a response plan? What does that response plan look like?
No, absolutely. I mean, it begins first with having the proper resources in place to detect such intrusion, because so many different organizations out there don't even know that their systems have been breached or compromised for months or sometimes years in some of the more recent ones. So at first it starts with cloud security. I mean, if you don't know and you can't track who has access to your data, both on the cloud and internal into your organization, you have to have the proper resources, followed by having proper audit controls as to who access what, when they access it. That all leads into being able to establish a plan, and again, knowing where that data came from. So if it's a third party or a first party type of data that was breached, being able to notify those individuals, whether it's MLS or whether it's a data vendor that you're purchasing data from, as to what elements were accessed and how much was pulled down. If you can focus on those things, you are already so far ahead of so many organizations out there that may not have those types of plans in place, because you see so many times these large publicly traded companies, they never knew that they were breached, and then when they were actually breached, the extent was not discovered until months after the initial disclosure of what was actually accessed. So having some of those key items, know who's accessing, when it was accessed, and then the plan to notify people you're accessing data from or buying data from, those are some 3 critical components you need to have in your organization.
Okay. Stephen, do you have a response plan in place at the brokerage?
We do, and I would completely agree with those comments. We do have a response plan, and yet we have to remind everyone every time there's an incident that we have a response plan, and that this isn't the first time we've gone through this drill, although it feels like Groundhog Day whenever it happens. The organization is usually the last to find out about a security incident. We're fortunate because our exposure has been minimal so far, but we typically find out from an agent or a client who has lost track of tens of thousands of dollars during a wire transfer, and generally the simplest cause is the explanation, a compromised password. But the typical incident report looks something like, our email has been hacked, the servers are down, close the network. We have a response plan. We also do a lot of internal education, like you mentioned, security awareness training. And then we have to have actual technical measures as well. And it's really a constant, it requires constant care and feeding, monitoring our security, doing the security awareness training, and informing our organization about what to do if.
Right. I think that's really key to compliance is really no joke inside any publicly traded company. I think most people that have worked inside one know that. We all sort of, moan every time we have to go through our annual compliance training, intended to educate all of us about, what to do in the event of us becoming aware of a particular breach or leak or anything like that. At CoreLogic, it's really, a two-pronged approach. The technical pieces certainly that Jonathan described are critical, and our technical services group really is, their first line of defense is detection and then immediate, kind of remedy for whatever might be happening there. But probably more importantly is kind of the business approach, right, where your compliance and legal team take over, analyze, what has happened, what the process is, again, based on the 50-plus privacy laws that are on the books today in North America. I mean, the reality is we all have laws that we have to comply with today, whether we get new kind of sweeping national legislation or state by state, things get updated to keep up with the internet. We all have privacy laws today on the books that we should be aware of. And so, having that legal and compliance team communicating with the executive team and establishing that, kind of level of response based on the level of severity of the issue is something that happens pretty quick inside, I think, any large organization these days, particularly post Equifax and Facebook, for sure.
Well, I think up till this point, we've been talking a lot about, some fear and uncertainty and doubt around the data that we all have. As we are almost running out of time for this session, what I'd like to end with is if you have any actionable items, so something that someone in the audience can go back to the office on Monday and Monday morning take some action on. What would you say is some of the actionable items that we can do around this?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with awareness. I mean, don't leave it up to reading a news article about the latest incident. Just be aware of what's trending in your local area. I mean, I think in the next couple years, we'll see probably something at the federal level that will come in with regards to privacy, but just simply have awareness. Be aware of what's going on with your legislative branches in your local government so that you can know what to be looking for over the hill, what's coming.
I would say that communication is really the key. The one thing I learned from hearing law enforcement talk about this is that we are all affected by these data security issues, and yet it's also a dirty secret that nobody wants to admit that their privacy may have been compromised. And so communication with your coworkers, within your organization, and with your clients is vital, whether it's education or just communication about do we have a response plan, and what are we going to do when? What are we going to do when we have a security incident? Not if, when.
When, for sure. I think just kind of if I were thinking about two things that you'd go home and do today, I'd say for the MLSs, go home and establish a written data governance policy, even if it's just simply documenting all the data you have today, where it came from, to some extent where it goes. You're really good at that on the MLS side because you have data licensing, right? So you're keeping pretty good track of that as it relates to MLS data. But think of all the other data you have, employee data, membership data, things like that, and begin to kind of look at what a data governance policy looks like for you. And for brokers, and really even for MLSs, try to help their brokers, one simple kind of seems too simple to be true kind of thing is putting that disclosure warning at the bottom of your emails to your consumers that notifies them, hey, beware of wire fraud, right? We've got some sample language, I think, that's out there that we've used in the past, but just that simple kind of notification to the consumer. I think about agents, they do disclosure all the time of things they're required by law to disclose, right? But if I were a broker today, I'd have a disclosure policy to my consumers that I handed them that said, hey, these are some things to be aware of during the process. People are going to try to steal your money. Here's how we're going to ask you for money every single time. If you get asked some way other than this, don't do it. That's very simple.
Good. And I guess from MLS listings, from an MLS perspective, some of the takeaways, we have this concept that we just went through recently. I've kind of given it a name of a data map, for lack of a better word. And what our data map has done is kind of what you just described. We went through and tried to identify all the personal identifiable information, or the PII, thank you, Stephen, our acronym guru here. The PII information that we hold, and it could be employees, it could be past employees, it could be members, and it could be people that are selling a house. So we have, in the agent remarks, so we have information about sometimes how to contact the seller to show the house or before you show the house. So we have a lot of PII. So what we've done is we've created a map that says, where does this information come from? Who entered it? Where did they enter it in to? What tool? Where is that stored? So I can then give it to the IT guys and say, hey, is this all secure? And then where does it go? So is it just stay with us? Does it go into ADP? Does it go into a data feed? Where does it go? And so we've created this map. And so now I've got this map in front of me, and I'm waiting for the new California laws to come out so I can look at that and figure out what am I going to have to do with the data to protect it once California has those new laws in place. So it's all, for us, it was all around the data map.
So you all need to borrow Dave's map, because he's ahead of you, probably.
And we just wrote a white paper on this too. So if you want to go to the MLS listings website, you'll see a white paper that we
Nice.
wrote around the data map.
You know, if I could just throw this out again, I mentioned IC3. IC3.gov is the Internet Crime Complaint Center operated by the U.S. government. And why is that important? Well, number one, you can learn something about just basic response policies to these kind of incidents by going there. The other reason it's important is if there is actually an internet crime that's been committed, nobody knows who to call. You know, it's
Yeah.
a bad version of Ghostbusters. Nobody knows who to call. You can't call 911 for wire fraud. You know, you can't call, you know, the police for, you know, hacking, but you can at least report it through ic3.gov, and I guarantee you that you probably have a local FBI task force that is specifically focused on these issues, and they will come out, if you ask them, and talk to your organization and do a security awareness from a law enforcement perspective. And that's actually kind of how I got on this track a couple of years ago.
Good stuff.
Great. Well, there you go. We have some actions to take on Monday when you get back. Well, thank you,
Thanks,
panelists.
Dave.
And
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.